Hello, I'm Victoria Kingston, co-founder of the West Cork History Festival. We're really sorry we aren't able to have a physical history festival this year, but we've put together some fantastic digital content for you in its place, available here on our website. We're focusing on two key themes, Cork in 1920 and Ireland and Empire, for which we have recorded a specially commissioned History Ireland Hedge School. We hope you enjoy these, and we look forward to seeing you in person in 2021. Now you can hear writer and historian Turtle Bunbury in conversation with Simon, the other festival founder. They're discussing Turtle's latest book, Ireland's Forgotten Past, A History of the Overlooked and Disremembered. Their lively discussion ranges from Neolithic passage tombs right up to 19th century railway building in West Cork via the Wars of the Roses in Ireland. We hope you enjoy it.
Well, hello, and as you know, we're unable to bring you the West Cork History Festival this year in physical form, but what we have been doing is taking a few of the highlights of the programme that we had in mind for people and recording them so that on the 8th of August, on the Saturday of the weekend that we would have been having the festival, you hear from at least some of the people that we were hoping to bring you that weekend. And one of those is Turtle Bunbury. We've been talking to Turtle and being encouraged by Turtle for the 3 previous years of the festival, and so we were delighted to have him agree to come and talk to us about his most recent book. As I say, we're unable to do that physically, but here we are virtually. So we're going to have 30 minutes or so with Turtle talking about his most recent book, which is available from all good bookshops, including Cathal O'Donovan's in Skibbereen, but also more widely, and it is Ireland's Forgotten Past, A History of the Overlooked and Disremembered. Turtle, how do you go about thinking about the content for a collection like this? Because it's incredibly broad-ranging, and the periods, the subjects are very widespread. How do you conceive of it?
Well, I suppose it has been a long time coming, really. I have, over the last 15 years plus, been gathering these little stories over, some of them I'd sort of written early versions of them for. And then it just struck me as quite a good time to try and collate them into it's quite a small book. And it's a sort of history of Ireland, but it's very structured for the first half. And then it becomes more sort of little tales of events that I think are less well known. Much less well known in some instances, but for me, I think it's kind of where I live. I live in County Carlow, and I'm surrounded by little bits of forgotten history everywhere. Just beside where my office is an old ring fort that's overgrown. If I go down a couple of fields from that, I've got the ruins of an ancient monastery beside a small river. It's almost disappeared, the monastery, but it was there. And again, just over the other side of that small river is a dolmen, a very beautiful example of a dolmen. And so, I feel pretty connected to all that. And then there's the fact that we're still always learning more. So even while I was writing this book, a neighbour of ours sent a drone over the barley fields just behind where that dolmen is. This was in the very long, hot summer of 2018. And for the first time ever, we realized that field was full of ancient things, old barrows and ring ditches and circular enclosures and all that stuff. And I thought, wow, well, that actually summons it up. We are walking past things that we don't even realize are all around us. So I was trying to capture some of that.
Yeah, that was the summer of Drone Henge, wasn't it?
That was Drone Henge, exactly, Drone Henge.
Yeah, they found that in the bend of the Boyne, didn't they? That same summer, all these extraordinary.
Yeah, exactly. So the new details are coming out from places like that, and it was incredible. In fact, I had to update my book a number of times because people were finding things out about stuff that was built 5,000 years ago. So suddenly my book was out of date. I was like, why? But these things have been there for 5,000 years. Now my book's out of date. So I had to sort of do a bit of an update on that. And then, there's other things actually in Newgrange. You may be aware that earlier this year, there was a study came out about they'd studied some of the remains of the people who were buried in Newgrange within the passage tombs and worked out that they were close relatives of people who were buried in Sligo and Carramore and Carrowkeel. And they've managed to figure out that, and that's 150 miles between those two places. So that was fascinating. And then there was other more arguably disturbing revelations about how that same person that they were looking at was the offspring of a first-degree incestuous union. So,
yes, they were just close relatives, full stop, it would appear.
it was either siblings or parent and child. So that was a bit of a head spinner.
Victoria, who co-founded the festival with me here, worked on the new exhibition at Brú na Bóinne, and so this at that point was a dark secret. It hadn't yet been revealed, but it was known about by the archaeologists. And when you start Ireland's Forgotten Past, in the very distant past, and I mean, we're going to touch over the next little while on a few of the Cork connections. It is, and this will be challenging for some of our viewers. It is not exclusively about Cork, this book, but there's quite a lot of Cork in it, and you begin, and there's some references to Mount Gabriel quite in some of the early sections.
Yeah, I mean, I went back as far as I could to begin with. In fact, began with the first evidence of, conclusive evidence of humans of mankind in Ireland, which is in County Clare, scores that one, which is a bear hunter who was knocking around about 12,800 years ago, if you can get your head around that. And they found the remains of a bear, or a knee patella bone, which had been smashed up to get the marrow out of it by somebody using some form of a stone flint. So I began with them, and then I sped through the Mesolithic period, which again, has plenty of lots for your Cork listeners there, from places up the Blackwater Valley or up at Ballyoran Bog and Gortro, which are both near Gortor, near Fermoy, and then further afield in Waterford and up famously at Mount Sandal near Coleraine. So I was really fascinated by these sort of trying to work out those mysteries, even though there is so little to work on. Everything is pure speculation and wild guesses to an extent. But the tiniest little shreds of evidence are very exciting in that world. So that's Mesolithic, and then followed by the Neolithic, which it brings me back to the dolmen that's beside me here, brings us back to the Newgrange, the discoveries there. Again, just really, really fascinating people to try and get your head around, and the knowledge that they seem to have had of farming, agricultural practices, perhaps picked up from Mesopotamia, it had fed through over the course of centuries. And they knew they had clever devices, energy-saving devices. They knew how to use pack animals to carry weights. It's the first sort of time we're seeing that going on in Ireland. Mining, they were mining for porcelainite, especially up in Antrim, which is very tough china-like stone that was very good for axes and sickles and stuff like that. So. And then the Cady fields, of course, as well, would be, from that period, which is an amazing sort of 3,000 acre dairy farm, is, which again could be as far back as 3000 BC. I found it mind blowing, and it was an I knew I was sort of treading into the world of archaeology there. So yeah. I was in consultation with a number of different archaeologists, and I know there are, like as with history, there are many different interpretations of all of these things, and it's hard not to sensationalize a little bit of something, and maybe you've got it wrong, but it's just so exciting. So the Neolithics feed into the Bell Beakers, who again, it's hard to judge, and that's one of the areas of controversy. What happened to the Neolithic people? Were they integrated into the Bell Beakers? Not really. It seems like there was a massive population decline around about that time. Like to the tune of 90% of the indigenous population sort of appear to have disappeared. Was it plague, or was it something more sinister? In any event, Bell Beakers, that does bring us to Mount Gabriel, because they again, the best guess is that they came up from Portugal and came up the coast there in pursuit of riches, particularly copper. That was the biggie at the time. They'd worked out that copper was, axes and knives that are made of copper are going to be much more effective and durable than stone implements. So that was what they were hunting for. They started off at Ross Island in Kerry, and then set up the one in Mount Gabriel in West Cork. And I was down there very recently, and that was a massive project. They sank 25 mine shafts into the side of the mountain near Skull. Again, this is about 2200 BC, that sort of period, the sort of early part of the Bronze Age. And they were, this is an extract from the book for one moment. It is, fires were lit against the face of each shaft, 25 shafts. Pots of water were then hurled on the scorched rock, causing it to shatter before the labourers advanced with cobble scoops and stone hammers to draw the copper out. So, that in itself is amazing that was going on at Mount Gabriel, but they had other copper mines at the Allihies, of course, famously on the Bear, and Bunmahan in Waterford, Avoca and Wicklow. And they were making, an estimated 370 tons of finished copper was reckoned to have been produced in Ireland during those sort of centuries, over the space of about 200-300 years. So that was all fascinating. And again, right beside where I live, there is this extraordinary place called Rathgall, which was a Bronze Age workshop for manufacturing glass beads, exotic glass beads. This is a little bit more recent, 900 BC, but they were working with turquoise, jet and lignite, amber, gold, stone, using it all to make jewelry. So I started talking a bit about jewelry and the gold and all those strange fetishes of our Bronze Age forebears.
And fascinating also that these people came to Mount Gabriel by sea. These were people who arrive in Ireland from, potentially, as you say, from Portugal. The marine context is one that we keep coming back to at the History Festival here. So interesting.
That's obviously, and as did the Neolithics and the Mesolithics and the bear hunters from County Clare. They all have to get here. You have to get to an island somehow, right? But it is very interesting that, and obviously they keep on finding Neolithic boats as well, which I just think is so intriguing. But that marine age, and it makes complete sense that we're to be linked from Portugal, up that coast all the way, and indeed down into the Mediterranean and North Africa.
The sort of the north-south axis as opposed to the east-west one, which is the one we tend to think about.
Exactly. Which came a little bit later. I mean, that's kind of where the book starts going now, in fact, because we are moving. And in the book, I do talk about from the Bronze Age. I go into some of the sort of the bog bodies and the old tohers, the old trackways that were coming up in the sort of Celtic age. And then move into the Romans and the time of the Romans. And obviously Ireland was not conquered by the Romans, but the Romans had a strong presence in trading circles. There is sort of, the jury's out about what their role was, if any, in Cork. There was a hoard of coins was found at a place called Cuskenny Marsh, or maybe I'm pronouncing it wrong, Cuskenny, near Cork Harbour. And there was a hoard. It was 10 coins, but they're from the 3rd and 4th century, and brass coins. But were they, dropped by a trader, or did some Georgian gent drop them overboard as he was rowing home from his, grand tour? The jury is out, as I say. But so I think the thing about the book, as I say, the first part of it is very much chapter to chapter, era to era, going from the Romans and so forth. So before long, you're going through the high crosses and the holy wells to the Vikings. And again, Cork is part of the story of Sitrick Silkbeard, who is this guy who was king of Dublin for 46 years, which is an amazing achievement to have lived for 46 years in those days without being murdered by your nearest and dearest. Anyway, his son Olaf led an attack that destroyed Brian Boru's fleet just down at Cape Clear. So I tell a bit about the background of that story there.
And you talk later about thinking of warring kings and would-be kings, about the story of Perkin Warbeck. Tell us a bit about that. We're leaping forward in time a bit.
It is a leap. It's a leap forward. We go through the Normans and all that malarkey. But it's very hard not to, and I was a Game of Thrones enthusiast, and it was very hard not to get overly excited by the Wars of the Roses. And in Ireland, in Irish history, they were never really a big part of what I learned of Irish history. But they played out very much across Ireland, the wars between the houses of Lancaster and York, and particularly between the Fitzgeralds and the Butlers. The Fitzgeralds being Yorkists and the Butlers being Lancastrians. And my mother is a Butler, so I've always been aware of that conflict. And I didn't realize that actually, most of it actually traces back to the Wars of the Roses, or an awful lot of it anyway. There was a place called Pilltown in County Kilkenny where very early in the Wars of the Roses, the Butlers had a very bad day when the Fitzgeralds were triumphant in a pitched battle that lasted all day and left apparently 400 Butlers dead, which must have been quite a lot of your family in those times. But they all they come through in a couple of generations later. A couple of decades later, you have Perkin Warbeck's rebellion. And Perkin Warbeck was a Flemish peasant, as they were referred to in those days, who claimed to be one of the princes in the Tower, murdered by Richard III, who was his uncle. It's a very dramatic story. And Lord Desmond, the Earl of Desmond, the head of the Fitzgerald family in Munster, was one of Warbeck's principal backers. And in fact, John Walters, who's the mayor of Cork, was another. And many of leading Cork citizens were fully invested in Perkin Warbeck. In fact, he'd even learned to speak English in Cork. And his rebellion basically fell apart because his forces were unable to capture Waterford, for which Waterford gets its motto today. What is it? Urbs intacta mane Waterfordia. Waterford remains the untaken city. But Perkin Warbeck and Walters, the mayor of Cork, were both executed in the aftermath. This is 1499. And Cork, its punishment, the city of Cork was punished by having its charter forfeited temporarily. But in return for that, it also became known as the Rebel City. So there's the origin of the species. The Perkin Warbeck story is great. And one of the guys who was involved in suppressing his rebellion was James Dove Butler, back to the Butlers again, Black James Butler, who's got another pretty interesting story. So he's obviously arch enemy of the Fitzgeralds, and the Earl of Kildare, another of the Fitzgeralds, and him are bitter opponents, but they come together epically in St. Patrick's Cathedral and agree to shake hands through a hole cut in a door of the chancery door in the cathedral, and that risk of plunging your hand in, not knowing where it's going, is the origin of the expression "to chance one's arm." So it's all the origins of these strange expressions.
And that door can be seen to this day, can it not?
It is, yes. It's on display in St. Patrick's Cathedral right now, if we're allowed into St. Patrick's Cathedral.
Well, we will consult with the Bishop of Cork, John and Ross, on that. I'm sure he will inform us. But then you keeping to our Cork connections, and also your family connections, we can jump forward a century. And William Stanley.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, William Stanley, I've always been enthused by him. The very first Bunbury connection to Ireland involved a guy called Thomas Bunbury, who was a trustee of Lismore Castle in the 1580s, just before Sir Walter Raleigh got hold of it. I'm learning to say Raleigh, not Raleigh. I was interested in that. And then I realized that it was owned by a guy called Sir William Stanley, who was Thomas Bunbury's half-brother, Margaret Bunbury being the mother of the two men. And Stanley is about as interesting a guy as you get in the Tudor age, which is an age when there are nothing but interesting, people turning up left, right, and centre. And he's one that I felt was, very little was known about him, really. There's no big fat book about him, or not even a small book about him. He was born in England and raised as a Catholic, which makes him very unusual in the Tudor army of Elizabeth I, but we're now in the 1560s, 1570s. So he puts his religion aside, joins her army, and excels as a commander. And he comes to Ireland in 1570s, 22 years old. It is, as I say, the time of Raleigh and Sir Humphrey Gilbert and Edmund Spenser, the poet, and all these guys are all knocking around Ireland. And it's just on the eve of the Desmond Rebellion, which breaks out in 1579 when Gerald Fitzgerald, who is the 15th Earl of Desmond, he launches a massive offensive against the English forces across all of Munster. So William Stanley is very involved in trying to, counter this, very proactive in the Tudor army, and succeeds. He captures huge chunks of Munster. He captures the Fitzgerald strongholds at Adair, for instance, another one at Castlemaine, and does very well. He's knighted by the Lord Deputy of Ireland in Waterford. Sir William Drury knights him in maybe 1579, I think. The next year, you have that Glenmalure ambush up in the Wicklow Mountains when Fiach MacHugh O'Byrne, his men annihilate an English force, killing maybe 800 English soldiers. It's a big event at the time. And Stanley is sent up there to hunt out O'Byrne and his men, and does pretty well. He gets high praise from the Tudor government in Dublin for his efforts. By 1585, he is commander of Lismore Castle, which is when Thomas Bunbury comes in as one of the trustees of the castle, because he's put in charge of it. He had hoped to become the president of Connacht at this time. That didn't happen. He was made Sheriff of Cork instead, and a pretty tough sheriff to have had around. He claimed to have hanged 300 rebels and left the rest of Cork so petrified that, this is his own words, a man might now travel the whole country and none molest him. So he's there for a year, I think, before he's sent north to confront a rebellion in Ulster, Sawley Boy MacDonald. He goes up there and he gets ambushed, and he gets very badly wounded and has to go back to England to recuperate. And while he's back in England recuperating, the Desmond Rebellion ends. Desmond himself is captured, is betrayed and captured and executed, beheaded. And the result of that is that Queen Elizabeth's government basically annexes 500,000 acres of Munster. It's such a massive amount of land. And, having been part of the force initially that, helped win that war, Stanley had high hopes that he would get some of the spoils of victory. So Raleigh, for instance, got 42,000 acres. But he was in a special place, right? So Stanley had high hopes, but he was therefore deeply dismayed when he got diddly squat. Nothing, didn't get anything. He's told to go and help the English in another war against the Spanish in the Netherlands. So he's bitter about this. He's been snubbed, and it's at this point he starts conspiring with the Queen's enemies, principally Jesuits and Spaniards. And the idea is now in his head that maybe we can get rid of the Queen and put a Catholic on the throne of England. We're now moving into sort of 1587. Yeah. And his moment of the greatest shock, because he's still actually a hero in the Elizabethan army, and the Tudors have still thought quite highly of him. Maybe some were suspicious by now. Anyway, they should have been, because in 1587, he hands over a key fortress in the Spanish Netherlands to the Spanish. It had been captured by the English, had it. And he hands it over to the Spanish, which is like brazen treachery. And there's a great lesson in there, because it turned out that just about a week before he handed that over, the Queen and her Privy Council, Queen Elizabeth and her Privy Council, had met to discuss who should be the next Viceroy of Ireland. And the Queen herself had suggested Sir William Stanley would be perfect. And the next thing she hears is he's handed a fortress over. So if he had only waited a week, God knows where history would have gone.
Elizabethan email would have made it a very different
email or Zoom or Snapchat. Exactly, that's what they were missing as ever. So instead, he's complete persona non grata. He's just declared a traitor. He flees to Spain, and he becomes one of the advisors around Philip's round table planning the Spanish Armada. His advice is actually to come in through Ireland, and it's ignored. And obviously the Armada goes on to be one of the greatest disasters in Spanish history. But he continues to live a very interesting life in exile. He is in commander of a regiment of Catholic soldiers, many of them from Ireland. and he oversees, or is certainly involved in, at least 4 foiled assassination attempts against Queen Elizabeth and against King James, her successor. And when you think of the Guy Fawkes plot, for instance, the gunpowder plot, Guy Fawkes and Tom Winter, who was another of the key conspirators, they were both officers in William Stanley's army. So, you know, he's right in there, but somehow he survives remarkably. He lives to be 80 years old, and he died in 1630 as a recluse in Belgium.
And you talk about possibly Lord Cecil is involved in some way in securing that reprieve for him. There's some backroom deal that they cook up.
That's right. Yeah, there's some sort of mysterious backroom deal. I mean, I think there's still plenty more to be found out about him. You know, I didn't have time to do a proper dig, nor do I have the expertise to do so. But I'd love it if somebody else would take him on.
And really, I mean, a fascinating survivor. And you talk in the chapters that follow the one on William Stanley, public enemy number 1, as you call him, about a series of really vivid figures, who each of which might deserve a book. Peg Plunkett, the Queen of Vice, I was deeply drawn to, and unsurprisingly, as our audience would know, she is no Cork Connections, because Vice is an unknown phenomenon in this county. But you conjure up a whole series of these extraordinary lost stories. Very interesting when you come to the 19th century, and in a way the bit of the 19th century that in the rebel county in particular doesn't always get as much attention as you might expect, and that's the period of positive economic growth, reconstruction and investment by government. Talk to us a bit about that. We're leaping again another few centuries, and your readers will be able to make a more sedate march through the history of the nation in the book. But tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, okay. Well, this is a pretty interesting period. I again, it's something that, as you say, it's not very much talked about in Ireland, and it is well known as the era of constructive unionism, or killing home rule with kindness, as it sometimes is called. And actually, funnily enough, it links back to, you mentioned Salisbury earlier, or Robert Cecil. And then it's amazing, you know, that was Robert Cecil knocking around in the Elizabethan age. Fast forward to the Victorian age, and who's in charge of England? Well, it's Robert Cecil, was the Salisbury, the Earl of Salisbury, Marquis of Salisbury, I think, wasn't he? And he is the Prime Minister of a very, very strong conservative government. And we are now in the 1880s, the late 1880s. And they are basically, they're kind of seizing a moment. The Liberal Party has split over Home Rule. Charles Stewart Parnell has fallen from power, from grace, and they are seizing a moment to say, well, now let's finish off this Home Rule business. And Salisbury, in this regard, he is helped by his nephew, who is Arthur Balfour, later to become a famous Prime Minister in Britain, of course, but he was the Chief Secretary of Ireland from 1887 to 1891. And he, well, actually, it's well known that he was the nephew of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister got him the job, and therefore is another phrase origin, Bob's your uncle, because Robert Salisbury was the Prime Minister, as I say. Anyway, Balfour is like all the Conservatives of that period, fiercely opposed to Home Rule, very determined to wipe out nationalism in any way he can. He passes the No-Nonsense Coercion Act of 1887, which he ends up becoming immortalised in Irish nationalist law as Bloody Balfour, partly because of that and partly because of what became known as the Mitchelstown Massacre, when police opened fire on an unarmed crowd in Mitchelstown and killed 3 people. So that's generally what we know about Arthur Balfour, but less well known is that while, yes, he absolutely believed that coercion would somehow eliminate nationalism, he also wanted to treat its causes. And I think it was quite ingenious what he did, actually. He went on an extensive tour of Ireland. Sometimes I wonder if it's because he had the advantage of being a bachelor without a family commitments or anything like that. He was a very shy, aloof, kind of academic individual, really. But anyway, he had, because of his academia, he'd made a very detailed study of the works of a guy called James Hack Tuke, who was a Quaker philanthropist who had been so appalled by what had happened in Ireland, particularly in the western parts of Ireland, in and during and after the famine. And he'd written a lot of studied about it. Balfour read up that, and that basically formed the basis of constructive unionism. And his kind of logic was that the Irish are mostly apathetic. This is his opinion. He said they become rebellious, they become revolutionaries because there's sod all else to do. And he basically, and he had other concerns about overcrowding and crop failures and the blight and people being over dependent on potatoes, but fundamentally he wanted to revolutionize how the West operated. It was massive. What he did was enormous, primarily through the Congested Districts Board, which he establishes in 1891, and this is a pioneering regional planning agency. And that can sound very dull when you announce that to people that I'm writing about a pioneering regional planning agency. But when you look at what they did and their powers to stimulate agriculture and fishing and so forth across Ireland, it was massive. And it was primarily aiming at looking at the poorer parts of Ireland, forgotten parts of Ireland, many places where they predominantly spoke Irish was their language. Initially, from Donegal all the way down the Atlantic shore to West Cork, and in places that I've travelled far and wide through that with the Vanishing Ireland project, and you see that this is land where there's not much more to work with than bog and stone. So how do you bring industry to these places? So they have a massive survey, a very thorough survey, and then they start kicking in with the projects. And have you got time for a quick nutshell of some of these projects?
Yeah.
Well, the fishing, that was one of the big parts of it. To stimulate the fishing industry, they ignited what ended up being the greatest era of pier building in Irish history. And they built 128 new works along the Atlantic coast by 1900. They are piers, they are either new piers or improving existing ones, quays, boat slips, landing places, beacons and lighthouses. They bought fleets of cutters and hookers and fishing equipment for the fishing communities up and down the coast, invested in boat building, 20 fish curing stations. So, that in itself made a massive difference. You can see evidence of it from Killybegs all the way down, to this day. A massive moment for the West Coast, the early Wild Atlantic Way style scheme. Mm-hmm. Then elsewhere, you get bridges and new roads, you get drainage schemes, you get fencing. There's a lot of investment in local crafts and cottage industries, lace making, handloom weaving, knitting, tweed making, Donegal tweed, things like that, carpet making. If you were farmers, they were bringing in agricultural experts from England and elsewhere in Europe who would advise people about, crops and livestock. They were bringing in cattle, Aberdeen Angus and Shorthorns, and stocking them, sending them over to the west of Ireland. They were working out how to refine breeds of workhorses and donkeys. There was so much investment going in. Horace Plunkett ends up coming back if he's been over on his ranch in Wyoming, and he comes back in the middle of all this and says, wow, this is incredible. So he establishes the cooperative dairies as part of that basically creates the high standards of dairy produce that Ireland has to this day, right? So you've got all of those things, which in itself would be amazing, but I still haven't mentioned the big one, which was the most visible one, which was the railways. Obviously, the railways have been it's already over on the east coast of Ireland and in the more populous or the richer, more prosperous parts of Ireland. But now it was time to bring them into the wilds of, Donegal, Mayo, Connemara, West Clare, Kerry. So you end up with something like 16,000 men laying 15 new railway lines, over the course of the 1890s. At a huge cost. Sometimes I saw an estimate, I don't know if this is how accurate it is, but that there was sometimes £500,000 a mile in today's money. But you can believe it, because that includes, if anybody knows the viaduct that goes across the estuary at Ballydehob, which brings the Skibbereen to Schull railway line into West Cork. There's another viaduct that brings the Connemara Railway across the River Corrib from Galway City. And that shortened the journey. It's 49 miles from Galway City to Clifton. And that used to be done with an 8-hour journey of you being squished inside a Bianconi coach, really very unpleasant, 8 hours. And that was suddenly shortened to 2.5 hours on a train. So massive impact. And also it enabled, like the fishermen, for instance, who we mentioned earlier, are now able to put their mackerel and their herring onto a train and get it over to Dublin. You're bringing in gentry fishermen with their big wallets. Are coming in to go fishing and shooting on the West Estates. But the downside, of course, is that people are actually also able to get on the trains to leave these already, struggling parts of the world. They say, wow, I can get on that train. I'll be in Dublin in 4 hours or whatever. So,
yeah, I mean,
pledged.
Really, I'm fascinated. The sheer scale of it that you evoke is I mean, he's of course known cheekily as famous as Bloody Balfour, or the man who's famous for his light railways and his heavy punishments. And that it's interesting. One of the people who hovers as a kind of shade over the West Cork History Festival is Edith Somerville, and it's a great short story written, I think, inspired by that stretch of light railway from Ballydehob out towards Schull, called the Silver Fox.
Okay, right.
Which
you'll have to read that, right?
And it conjures up the civil engineering challenge, I mean, the structural effort required and the expense, clearly, to do what they did in the parts of the country that those railways were created.
Well, I mean, I think that's it. And it really, it is the 1890s. It was an incredibly optimistic time for Imperial Britain. And that's what it is. Let's make no bones. This is an imperial project. But at the same time, they are employing the very extremely talented engineers, as you say, to come up with these incredible designs that are coming across Ireland, having learnt their craft in India and Myanmar and all these other places.
And the perfect segue, Turtle, because one of the other strands of the festival program for this year and indeed next year will be Ireland and Empire, Ireland's response to Empire, opposition, participation, of course, Irish people all over the then British Empire, and ambivalence about it. And I guess this is a classic case of where we do feel a little ambivalent about imperial legacies, parts of which are positive, parts of which clearly are not.
Yeah, I mean that is the thing. I mean the Irish and the Empire story is something that I've long been very interested in. In fact, I did a big project down in Cork Harbour a couple of years ago. And yes, I mean, for instance, in terms of the Black Lives Matter campaign, Cork Harbour was, of course, a major provisioning centre for all the ships heading out to the West Indies and toing and froing from West Africa. So there is much to be uncovered there. Perhaps it's a dark and tricky area to get to, and very, I suppose the details about it are, I think, still very much buried. So knowing what the proximities of this is we're going to learn a lot more over the next few years.
And that, I mean, putting you on the spot, we will invite you to Skibbereen to talk on that perhaps and other things. And it's interesting, you talk in the epilogue of this book about the inclusive nature of remembrance in Ireland in recent years, and what that inclusive approach to thinking about our history, and you've been one of the people who has exemplified this, has done to our sense of ourselves now, as well as the sense of the traditions from which we come.
Yeah, I think this is the decade of centenaries, basically, which I think has been really so extraordinarily interesting from a historian's point of view. It's like, wow, really, we're going to be, marking all these events. But yes, the Titanic, the Lusitania, the RMS Leinster, the ships. My father was in the Navy, so I've always had a strong interest in those. The whole passage of the Home Rule Bill, obviously the strike and lockout of 1913, the start of the war, all the battles of the war and how they all played out, and the assassination of the Archduke, all these centenaries, and then moving on to the Easter Rising itself, and now we're into the War of Independence. So many centenaries, and the Spanish flu with its modern correlations. It really has been pretty extraordinary. I think by and large, I was very impressed with how honest the interrogation. Somebody else used that word, and I thought it was a great word, how much we'd interrogated our past in Ireland. I think there's been a really good job on that. My conclusion to the book may have been a little too over-optimistic, because I'd written it just before the whole RIC, that controversy reared up shortly after my book was published. And I was like, oh, am I being too optimistic? Have we actually, got over all of these things? I think we have. I mean, I think by and large we really have. And I think, it's okay for people to say, hey, my grandfather was, or my great-grandfather was in the army in World War I or possibly even World War II. I think we have moved on from that. Whether you can celebrate or how you commemorate that, those are big issues.
And it's fascinating. Again, I think we'll still be talking about this in August 2021 and for many years to come. I was interested though last night, and it will be available on our website alongside this, talking to a local historian here, Kieran Doyle, who's been mapping all of the memorials of the revolutionary period in the county of Cork. And intriguingly, he talked about 21st century memorials in Cork and how much more inclusive they are, including local memorials to RIC men, as well as local memorials to women, to civilians, to non-combatants who were not previously memorialized. So it's interesting, maybe there is a local compensation for a national failing there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good to know, and that's very. I think the same sort of thing has been happening in other parts of Ireland, but that's really good to hear that. And so that talk is coming up then.
Yes, it will be, and it will be available on our website on the 8th of August. So, Turtle, we've been talking about this book, Ireland's Forgotten Past, and we urge all of our viewers to read it who haven't already. But tell us about the next project, the next book.
Well, the next book is also published by Thames and Hudson, and it is called The Irish Diaspora, and it is 45 stories about 45 different Irish men and women, sometimes groups, who have made an impact around the world in times past over the last 1500 years. I start off with some of the monks who were making their impact in Europe in the 6th century, 7th century, and right up to the modern times.
We will seek to persuade you to come and talk about that and other things next year. But Turtle Bunbury, thank you very much for participating in the virtual effort that we've made this year.
You're most welcome, Simon, and I will definitely get down to West Cork History Festival 2021. Come on, bring it on.
Fantastic. Thank you.
You're most welcome.